According to a June 17th report from Microsoft, employees are increasingly suffering from what they call the infinite workday, a world where there is no clear beginning or end to their work any longer. And from the moment they wake up until the time they go to sleep, team members are increasingly feeling, whether it's justified or not, that they need to always be on, need to always be responding to emails, always responding to texts, always hyper responsive to the needs of a client or the needs of their team. And the results of this are certainly not going to be great. I think this is likely a recipe for burnout or worse if it is left unchecked. But the good news is I believe that this is avoidable, assuming that as a leader, you don't want to create an environment like that. I do believe it can be done with a little bit of intentionality. And in this video, I want to give you 12 suggestions for how you might go about doing that and how you can prevent the infinite workday from becoming a reality inside of your organization. So how do you do it? First of all, step one is you need to model it yourself. Your team, whether you know it or not, does what you do. And so if you are sending emails at 10 o'clock at night or at 5 in the morning, your team implicitly assumes that's what you expect of them, and that's what you are wanting them to do as well. And so they will default to the behavior that you exhibit. And so I don't think leaders fully appreciate this, the extent to which you can have stated preferences and things that you write down, but your team is going to largely derive their marching orders from the things that you don't necessarily say, but the way in which they see how you operate. And so modeling the ideal behavior that you want is going to be critical. Step two, assume that's the case. How do you go about this? Like, you are probably got to where you are because you're a go-getter and because you work hard yourself. And so you probably don't necessarily have good hard edges around this. And especially in the beginning, this is probably a process. And so right now, current state, you probably have a ton going on as well. And so you're probably sending messages at night, messages in the morning, because those are the only times that you can catch up on your work. But this does not mean that just because you send those messages that your team has to receive those messages. So an easy way to start this is, if you're working at night or early in the morning, schedule your messages to be sent within business hours, right? So again, even if you have to catch up on work, if you recognize that by you sending an email at 10 o'clock at night that your team is inferring from that you expect them to be on at 10 o'clock at night, an easy way to avoid it is you can still send that email at 10 or that Slack message at 10, but just use the built-in tools for scheduling to send during business hours. That's a real piece of low-hanging fruit that anybody can do, and it just requires a little bit of discipline. Number three, realize that a major part of this problem is a function of meetings. You spend most of your day probably in meetings, and as a result, you're trying to catch up on work outside of business hours. And a lot of those meetings don't necessarily need to happen if you're honest with yourself. Again, there are benefits to meetings. I think meetings have a lot of upside in terms of shaping culture. They are ways to teach your team how to show up as people inside of an organization. And it's a great way to model patience, model critical thinking, model making hard decisions with limited information, how to model taking disparate ideas from different people and filtering all of that. And they learn a lot of that through osmosis. And so there definitely are upsides to having meetings, but you probably can get away with fewer meetings, and as a result, have less work that you need to do in the evenings. And work to reduce the number of meetings that you have to the ones that truly matter is a good rule of thumb. And so how do you go about doing that? A bunch of suggestions, which brings me to point number 4, which is write more things down. So I think a lot of times these meetings and calls are downstream of a lack of discipline, right? And if you avoid doing the hard work of documenting your thoughts and putting them down on paper, then the meeting is the only way to accomplish that. So get in the habit of writing things down. One approach is the whole Amazon memo. Amazon has a practice of forcing people to document their thinking in writing before having a meeting, and then first start the meeting by people actually reading the document. It's a great way to clarify your thinking and make sure that you've thought through things. Another really great example that I like is called Rapid. I got this from Matt Mockery, who's an executive coach. It's a fantastic way to make asynchronous decisions. So one person writes down the situation, any relevant facts or data associated with that situation, and then they make an initial recommendation. And then other people who need to be consulted have access to this document, and they chime in basically through comments, again, in writing in the document. And there might be 1 round or 2 rounds of back and forth that way. And then the decider, the person who is responsible for ultimately making a decision about this issue, reads the document. Perhaps they might ask one more round of questions or whatever. and then they make a decision. And only if you cannot resolve it in this manner do you decide to schedule a meeting. It's exercising discipline around writing things down and forcing people to read those things is a really great way to cut down on the number of meetings that you have. Another one, which brings me to point 5, is getting in the habit of making decisions in meetings. So a lot of times the outcome of a meeting is that we're all going to think about it and then we're going to have another meeting, which is a horrible meeting hygiene. Most decisions are reversible, and getting out of the habit of saying, I'm going to think about that as a legitimate outcome of a meeting is really important. I think that's a lot of times it's just an excuse to avoid making a tough call. So just decide in the meeting. Recognize the difference between a reversible and an irreversible decision, and assuming that it is reversible, decide then and there and move forward. Maintaining momentum, I think, is super, super important. And by getting in the habit of making decisions, I think you can cut down on the number of meetings you need to have. Number 6, this is related. Getting in the habit of capturing action items and deadlines at the end of meetings. Getting a person to specifically raise their hand and say, I am accountable for this and I'm going to get it done. And done means not just that it's completed, but also that they've reported that it's completed. If they've done the work but they haven't notified you, then it's not done. And so getting clarity and making sure that people actually capture that I'm accountable for this is another way to ultimately reduce the number of meetings that you have, because you're getting clear commitments from people rather than walking away with a vague set of next steps. You get real tangible clarity, and it makes it more likely that you're going to get those things done. Number 7, related to that, is avoid status meetings as much as you can. Sometimes they have to be done, but a lot of times you can handle these through like a morning check-in asynchronously, right? Posting status updates and compiling those asynchronously, allowing comments on documents and dialogue around status updates to happen asynchronously. And a lot of our days end up getting swallowed up by meetings that could be accomplished in other ways. And one of my favorite ways to do this is to push the tempo. So this gets me to kind of, I guess this is 7B, but when you get that commitment, a lot of times I think organizations settle into this weekly meeting cadence. So we're going to have this project, we're going to just have a weekly check-in. And the problem with weekly check-ins is that people end up just a lot of times waiting right until before the meeting to move the ball forward a little bit. And they use that weekly check-in as the impetus to drive the ball forward. If you as a leader, when you capture accountability and you capture next steps from a previous meeting, you also capture a deadline, and you have the deadline not be the next status meeting, you can again increase the tempo, increase the sense of urgency that people have, and simultaneously reduce the number of meetings that you ultimately end up needing to have as a result of that. Number 8, consider having some kind of cadence of no meetings. So this could be no meeting Mondays, it could be no meeting mornings, but giving your team time to do deep work and to move things forward, right? And consolidating all your meetings to the afternoon can be a really good practice as well. A lot of executives who've read Peter Drucker or whatever have really good discipline around doing this themselves, but team members often don't feel like they're empowered to do this. And they will allow anybody to put time on their calendar inside of an organization. And it takes some good discipline and often some executive air cover to tell them, just because you don't have something explicit on the calendar, feel free to create a deep work block and to keep that time sacred, and to tell people, hey, I'm sorry, I can't meet right now because I'm working on some other stuff. That requires a mandate often from higher up in the organization for people to feel empowered to be able to do that. And to avoid the situation of ad hoc saying, oh, I can't do that then because I'm having to do deep work, is just to set an expectation organization-wide that, hey, from 8 to 10 in the morning, we don't do meetings. And that allows everybody to get some work done and to focus. Related to that, point number 9 is to train your team to get in the habit of identifying what I call your most vital task, or your MVT, each morning, and then attacking it. So if you pair no meeting mornings, like if you have an 8 to 10 a.m. block where there are no meetings, and you train your team to identify what's the most important thing they could do to move their work forward and to tackle that first thing in the morning, that's a really powerful 1-2 punch that allows people to get their most important work done so that it doesn't bleed into their evenings. And they can consolidate all of their meetings in the afternoon, say between 10 and the rest of the day, or 11 and the rest of the day, or whatever it is. Number 10, train your team to constantly look for ways to automate or delegate. You want to always be pushing work down to the most qualified junior resource. And so getting really good at documentation, getting really good at training is super critical here. And that's something that you want to get good at, not just yourself, but you want to get your team good at too. And so getting back to the earlier point around getting in the habit of writing things down, A lot of the reason why we don't delegate is because we haven't done the hard work of thinking about how I actually do the work and writing down the standard operating procedure or the process for doing this is one manifestation of the habit of writing. And by getting really good at that, you now unleash a more junior resource to be able to do your work. The second part of that, though, is the training part. Now, that's a different type of work, and it feels uncomfortable for people who are used to doing, because doing the work is often different than editing the work or reviewing the work. It just requires new muscles to learn how to take off the hat of the person who does it and put on the hat of the person who's giving feedback. But that's a muscle that can be built if you give your team time and reps to do it. So getting really good at documenting and getting really good at providing feedback and training, I think, is really important. Number 11, if you're in professional services in particular, there are some types of work that are truly deadline driven, right? Attorneys often have deadlines, things like that. But many are not. And what they have just done is drifted into this always on culture where part of having good client services is being always on and being hyper responsive to customers. And they talk about it like a virtue, and in some ways it is. It's coming from a good place. But often there's no legitimate business upside to doing this. And often it's not because it's something that the client even asked for. It's just something that just a truism of this is how you do business. This is the way we've always done things here. And I think I would challenge you to maybe challenge that assumption. It's not always the case. And I think that you can solve this by setting better expectations in the beginning of an engagement. So if you are not in a legitimate industry or working on a project where there are legitimate deadlines, you have the ability to dictate to some degree at least how the engagement is going to go. And so I would encourage you, part of being a trusted advisor is giving clients reassurance that you've done this before and that you know exactly how this is going to unfold. And by giving them boundaries and communication timelines, I actually think it gives them reassurance. They're going to appreciate that you give them clarity around this is how this work is going to go. This is when I'm available and this is when I'm not. And most clients will honor that. They understand that you have multiple projects, that you have multiple things going on. And so unless they're a quote unquote bad client, they will probably honor that. And as long as you honor the commitments that you're making to them within the boundaries that you've identified, that will increase the level of trust that they have in you, not decrease it. So I would encourage you to not necessarily just default to when a client says jump, we say how high, or teaching your team that the standard operating procedure is to respond within an hour. Challenge the way that we do things here and ask yourself, like, are we truly a deadline-driven business, or is this a deadline-driven project? If not, you probably have more leeway than you think in terms of setting expectations for people. So that's a nuance that's probably specific to professional services, but I think it's a really important one because often we just drift into this always-on culture just because you came from other organizations where that's how they did it, and you didn't ask yourself the question of, is that the right way to run this business or not? So those are some suggestions on how to avoid this idea of the infinite workday. I think it requires discipline above all else to capture action items during meetings, to follow up, to push the tempo, and especially to write things down so that you don't always have to default to meetings in the first place. It also requires providing your team air cover and setting really clear expectations around periods of deep work, that it's okay to do deep work during the middle of the day. It's okay to say no to a meeting because you're focused on deep work, not just because you have an open spot on your calendar. And that training your team that often meetings are scheduled because somebody didn't do the hard work of writing something down or doing the hard work of thinking things through or moving the ball forward. So I would encourage you to, as a leader, think about ways to start to bake some of this stuff into your organization, modeling it yourself, modeling the habit of writing these things down, modeling the habit of allocating your mornings to do deep work or to focus on your most vital task, modeling the task of setting clear client boundaries and client expectations, and letting that descend down to the rest of the organization.